Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Claude Shirati, and tonight it's a Friday. We are talking. It's one of the episodes of the African Mindset series, and we're talking about wealth building and retirement strategies. You find out more about this and my guest in just a moment, right after this. Okay. Yes, so we're talking about wealth building and retirement strategies. I've got with me three guests that I will introduce quickly. Eugene Allman, who's in Sydney, and Prosper Taravinga in Melbourne, as well as Florence Mawa, and they are regular guests on this platform. And tonight, as I said, is about retirement strategies. Many of us obviously come from the African background, and the economies of our countries are not always stable. Therefore, retirement is not always something that we always talk about. But I know in the 70s, 80s, even early 90s, many of our economies were doing quite well, and there were lots of companies, and even the administration, the public administration was doing quite well, and people used to have very nice retirement. But then things got really worse, and it's a different story right now. And as we come to Australia, for those of us who are in Australia, we find a stable economy, stable jobs that are quite good paying, and the issue of superannuation and retirement strategies comes into the picture. But are we doing good enough in that aspect? So I'm going to put that question to all of our guests to see if we seem to be taking care of our retirement properly, and I guess it depends also on the age. If when you're young and you may be silly, I don't know, you don't think too much about retirement, but when that clock keeps ticking and the years keep unfolding, you start thinking of what will happen when you retire. So, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think about retirement in the Australian context? Okay, I don't like silence. I know it takes a little while, takes a little while to kick in, but yeah, I'm sure one of you will decide in the next few minutes or few days that they want to
Okay,
speak.
well, I might kick us off. Well, I
Yes.
think we were waiting for your traditional intro, Clyde. You usually pick on us. Anyway, I, I think for me, I feel very passionately about this particular subject. Financial literacy is something that I actually spend quite a bit of time on outside of my day job, because I do think that there is an aspect of education and knowledge that is lacking. I'm grateful that we're in a country that does have mandatory superannuation, but we know that even with that amount that is mandatory, it's not quite enough to get you to where you need to be if you're intending to stay in Australia. So if you look at the sorts of amounts that that are put out there from APRA and those sorts of places around the amount of money that you require for a comfortable lifestyle for a couple, it's around $64,000 a year for retirement. And if you think about the average migrant who's come here, probably in their 20s or 30s, usually without any sort of superannuation at all, that's a 20, 30-year period that they would need to accelerate the sort of lump sums that are talked about, because they talk about having about sort of 640,000 for a couple for you to get to the sort of payments that we're talking about, and you'd still need to use the pension for that. So it's I think this is something that as a community we actually need to talk about a lot more, because it's imperative that people understand the implications of what it means to get to that age and not have enough in the bucket to be able to live the lifestyles that you become accustomed to. And that's why we came here, right? Because you're looking for a certain lifestyle.
Sure. Yeah, Prosper, what's your take on that?
Fantastic. I'm very, very passionate about this sort of topic, because For starters, I thought I was going to be able to retire at 40, but it looks like I'm still going. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. I still have 2 years to go. But the one thing that normally happens is, for us, especially Africans coming in from an African descent, the life expectancy that we've become accustomed to or used to is usually people start getting old and dying at like 61. Whereas in Australia, you still have yet another 20 years from that 60 or 30 years even. Do you know what I mean? Where you are probably still, whereas in Australia, you still have yet another 20 years from that 60 or 30 years even. And you're healthy and, your financial situation still needs to be looked after. So I'm really wanting that this topic today really gets people blood pumping before it stops, before their hearts stop pumping, really, to really start looking into what we are doing, about the last mile that we haven't sort of looked into as a race.
Sure, Eugene.
Okay, well, look. First of all, two things. First of all, I'm definitely not an expert on this subject. I'm not an expert on wealth creation and things financial. So I'm going to talk the least today. If anything, I'm here to learn. I'd like to hear what other people have to say more. But what I can say just from my own perspective is that my trajectory has sort of been the reverse. I left Australia in 2001 and started living in Africa. So in my mind, the idea was like I took for granted that I'm not getting superannuation, that I'm not entitled to any pension, I'm not entitled to anything. And I have to make a plan and I have to figure this thing out. And I can't say that I have figured it out yet, but one thing that I have become aware of is, how this functions in Africa and how people kind of invest more in having a family structure so that they're looked after later on by that family structure and so on and so forth. So I'm kind of under, so I've had to think about it from that perspective.
Okay. Now, yes, Florence, go ahead.
I was going to say, Eugene, and Eugene, that's an interesting one that you mentioned there, just around the fact that the mindset about who's going to look after you in the future, because I think there definitely is a general, thought that, you have children who will eventually, you give them a good education, they'll go off and get good jobs, they'll look after you in the future. And I think that's one of the things that, at least with the cohort of people that I'm talking to in the diaspora, we're acknowledging the fact that we're in this sandwich in the middle where we don't think our children are going to make that commitment to look after us. But at the same time, we still have that commitment to look after our parents. And so it's money that's going out to look after them, plus also thinking about how am I going to set myself up so that I'm not a burden on my child who's probably going to tell me, sorry, you should have thought about that when you were working. And those are some of the things that we're really having to grapple with. Because if you look at the amount of money that goes out in remittances from the diaspora, it's a significant amount. And that is money that could be getting poured into, superannuation funds, could be getting poured into wealth building, could be getting poured into investments. But because it's sort of coming out, monthly, people probably don't realize just how significant the amount is over a period of time. And if you compounded that, what that would actually look like by the time you finish working.
Totally.
I love the word that you just used there, Florence, compounding. Like I think it was Albert Einstein who said compound interest. If you know about it, then you earn it. But if you don't know about it, you pay it. And some of those things that are actually happening, I think it's in its billions per year, the money that is remitted overseas. And I think it's just the episode last week where we were talking about the corruption. Now you can imagine we're talking corruption at a community, at a country level. Can you imagine the little intricacy, politics and corruption that also happens at a family level? And all that money might be being poured, from a sense of wanting to help. But if you really look at $100 sent across to maybe Zimbabwe, it arrives as $80, and then the black market does its thing. But if you put $100 compounded in about 10, 15 years, it could end up as, you know, a significant amount that you can actually contribute towards that 64,000 a year that you spoke about earlier. So, you know, it's a really hard balance, like you said, you know, the sandwich that you mentioned, where people don't quite know, okay, should I stay or should I go, or should I send money, or should I keep it for my own?
But this is the tricky part, because every time you send that remittance to somebody in Zimbabwe or wherever in Africa, every time you send that remittance to a particular person, right, that person can't keep all that money for themselves. That person is also has to give this to that person and that to that, like, and you have to accept that. You can't just say, listen, I sent that for you to do this. Why are you giving it to other people? You have to accept it, because they have their commitments as well. So everybody's intertwined, and everybody has accepted that they can't do it on their own. Whereas in Australia, we have this idea that everyone should somehow be self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big difference in both the mindset and the actual practicality of it, is that, you know, when you send that remittance, you're not doing it because you're a nice person. You're doing it because you have to. You have no choice. You know, you've got these commitments that you have with other, however these people came into your life, whether they're related to you or whether, you know, they've been brought into your life in some other way. But you're all interconnected. And I think that's the mentality, is that somewhere along the line, you know, that's how we all get looked after, is by investing in each other, you know. But there isn't that idea that in Africa that everybody should stand on their own 2 feet.
Also,
and so that's
also,
sorry, I was going to say,
yeah.
oh yes, go for it.
Oh no, you're right.
Well, so I was going to say, I think for me, that's also part of where this whole piece around the education comes in, right? Because I've started having conversations with people where people have either said, sorry, I'm not going to send you any money. And that's been very fascinating. Or conversations where people have said, I'm sending you money, but I'm sending you money to set up something that's income generating. And then that's it. I'll give you one lump sum, you know, go set up a chicken run or something and sell eggs. And I'm not giving you anything else. You sort yourself out. But again, it's the education piece, because if you're sending money to people who then also don't have anything that they can do to sustain themselves, they will just continue to look to you for that money. And then it becomes this self-perpetuating piece of everyone just feeding into to everyone else.
True.
Okay. Yeah. Prosper, you can make a point, then we'll move on from there.
Oh, absolutely. I'm also gonna say, if my dad is watching this show right now, don't believe what you see on the internet. I will always be sending money if I can. But you know,
Prosper is going to cut you off at the end of this year, and you'll not see him again.
Don't believe what you see on the internet.
You know,
it's funny.
At the end of the day, it just really boils down to that statement that we mentioned, that black text. But as an individual, you really need to, this is what I've always learned something new. I've always asked myself, what would I want this to look like in 10, 15, and 20 years? If I'm getting into a venture, or if I'm getting into business, or if I'm getting into a program, or if I'm meeting someone or a relationship, I ask myself, what do I want this to be like 10, 15 years? And if you want your relationship with the people back home to still be flourishing as if it was in 1995, then keep doing what you're doing. But if you want to have some sort of stable nest egg that you will actually have enough to then be sufficient later on down the track, then obviously you will do what is meaningful in terms of really growing your wealth in a place where it can accumulate. You know what I mean? And I don't know if we've flown, obviously we would have at some point, in the last 4 or 5 years, not in the last 2 years. But when you're in the airplane, they say, put your mask on first before you can put a mask on the people next to you, just so you can be able to be helpful later on. So if you're going to be poor later on, your health, is not adequate, your financial situation is not adequate, then you're not going to be helpful to the people that you are probably spending minuscule dollars and cents. So that's also yet another side to the coin.
All right,
Maybe
so-
to that point, just one thing that came to mind, the point about, starting the chicken run and so on that you mentioned earlier. Maybe that's one way of doing it, is to say, rather than I'm sending you this money to start a chicken run, but rather to say, because I still want to be connected to both places, I want to be connected to both, wherever it is in Africa and Australia, I'm the one who's going to start that chicken run or that business or whatever it is over there. And I'm the one that's going to start something that is not helping. I'm not sending it to you as here's remittance, but I'm starting an enterprise which can then support all of us, that can help all of us in future. Because I think people need to also understand that, I think, people don't always have a realistic, I mean, obviously Australia, yes, there's social security, there's compulsory superannuation and so on. But I think people often think that life here is a lot easier than it actually is. The picture that people have isn't realistic. They don't understand that actually prices are high. You have to have multiple jobs in order to survive often, and it is a struggle to do things here. So it should work both ways. There should be a way that we can create things that generate income, for everybody.
Okay, now coming back to Australia, obviously, for any one of us to retire comfortably, I suppose there are two main things in that equation. You have to have a comfortable income, and you have to have good investment strategies. Now, it looks to me that when we come here, people get a job, for example, and they seem to be quite comfortable. Obviously, the salary, the wages here are much higher than what we get in Africa. But then people seem to sort of feel very comfortable staying at one job for like 10 years, 15 years or more, rather than trying to climb the ladder and make more money. And then there's also the issue of investment, because if you're making money, if you have a comfortable job, then you should be in a position to be able to not only get a loan if you need to have a loan, or get some sort of capacity to get finance in order to make investment that will give you more money. At both levels, do you think in our communities people are sufficiently aware of these elements?
So I'm going to start, because in my day job, I work in HR, so that I have that lens around people changing jobs, and also about just generally salaries. So the first thing that I find, and I spend quite a lot of time talking to people about this, is that because of a lot of the times when people come in, they do not know how to benchmark themselves in the market. They will tend to go for jobs that they will tend to go for a salary that is not necessarily market competitive. And we do not have the conversations about finding out how much I should be getting paid for my job. So that in itself, I agree with you that in itself, there are people who, particularly if they're in jobs which aren't award jobs, where it's clearly articulated how much they should get paid, there does tend to be that discrepancy of people not knowing how much they should get paid. But the flip side of that is you could be getting paid $1 million a year, but if you're spending 9,999 of it, you're not going to make any money. So yes, it's all fair and fine to be climbing up the ranks, but I do tend to find that what happens is people climb up the ranks and their expenses also tend to increase with the amount of money that they're getting. And so their increasing salary doesn't necessarily actually mean additional money for them to be able to use for wealth building or savings or anything else.
I see. Yeah, Prosper, what's your take on that?
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like, like what Florence has just said, that a lot of people just settle for whatever job that comes their way. First of all, I don't know if you've ever been on this other side of the recruitment table. People have to jump through hoops to get into a job. And obviously their insecurities start kicking in. Oh, I'm probably from Africa. I'm not as good or whatever it is. So they just take what's coming to them. And by the time they play catch up with whatever super is on their way, hey, time has moved, and you're better off having time in the market than timing the market, especially when it comes to your own investments. But also coming to, like what you said, when people come into Australia, we're already maybe 10, 15 years behind anyone who has started off, saving for their super and playing catch up. I've always wanted to buy a pair of Jordans, and now I can afford it from working for a couple of hours. Let me have my thing. You know what I mean? So that's just what happens. And before you know it, by the time you wait for the Jordans to come from Amazon, you could have actually invested that money, and that money could have, compounded, like we spoke about. So I think financial literacy is such and I don't know if this is the right word, an epidemic from so many different levels, especially, I mean, from our brothers and sisters. We need to learn how to money, if that's the actual way of saying it.
How to money, okay. How to take care of the money, because that's all. It's all about financial literacy, knowing how to use the money that you get. It's not always about how much money you make, but how you use what you make, and eventually how you multiply that, because a part of your income has to meet your daily expenses, and then you also need to think about your future. And thinking of the future means that you put some eggs aside in some sort of basket and find some sort of multiplication strategy to do that. But it does take a lot to educate people, especially when people come. It's not easy to teach an old dog new tricks. I mean, not that we don't necessarily know these things, but you may know things sort of theoretically, but if you don't get to practice it a lot, and then it doesn't become part of your habits, and people are sort of on that survival mode a lot of the times, in the African background. So when they get here, there's a little bit of money, they just keep on going, using it. So what are some of the things that we need to do to try to address some of that financial literacy gap? Florence, you are in that space quite a bit.
So I get the sense that sometimes people think it's very complicated, and because they think it's very complicated, they just don't start, because they're thinking to themselves, where do I even start? This is too hard. And they're sort of thinking of, Wall Street, share trading, investments, it's like all these big words,
Yeah.
And it's some of it is just as simple as, are you contributing to your super over and above what the company is? Like, that's something that's very simple that you can literally do as when you start. And most of the super funds are actually able to give you financial advice on how much you can contribute. And if you're doing it pre-tax, even better. But something as simple as that, you literally just need to do it once, and you tell them how much, and they just take it every month or fortnight from your salary. And small little amounts like that, like literally even a $25 or a $50, the whole conversation about compounding can make a significant amount. But I think for me, the other piece as well is, and we keep talking about this in this series, is you need to have the curiosity and the mindset to actually find out things. Even if you just go to your local library, the amount of books they are on everything from, how to contribute to your super, to negative gearing, to, and you don't even have to pay a cent for that, right? So you could even start in that space. And then the other piece as well is, and I've found this particularly helpful personally, is like-minded people. So if you think that, the saying that they always say about you're the average of the 5 people that you spend the most amount of time with, if you find people who you see who are doing well, most of the time, if you go and ask someone and say, can you tell me how you're doing it? They're usually very happy to give you some tips or give you some information or let you, and that's another way. Like, you might be like, what, the book's too complicated. I don't understand what it is. Just find some people that you can actually see who you seem to be doing okay. And you can get off that. And the example that I'll use is there is a person in our community who actually got featured on Property Investment Magazine. And I'm going to say it was probably 4 or 5 years ago now, because of the portfolio that they had built up as a family. And when I read the article, I was blown away by what they'd done. And they're very open about the fact that they didn't know what they were doing. They just experimented, but now they've got a really good portfolio. I literally just picked up the phone and I said, do you mind? Would love to understand, what you guys did. And they were like, yeah, happy to. And I called a whole bunch of friends, and over an evening, we literally just hopped on. And this was during just when COVID started, start of last year. We hopped up to a Zoom call, and for like an hour and a half, they literally just talked us through their story, talked us through, their learnings that they had. And from that, found a community of other people, like-minded people who were interested in how do we build wealth as Africans. And we've now set up a group where people are now just sharing ideas. So it doesn't have to be complicated. I think my call out to people is just start somewhere, because you need to actually start.
Okay. Eugene, you wanted to say something?
No, look, I'm just listening. This is very interesting for me because I don't know much about this at all. So,
That's
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Prosper, you wanted to comment on that?
Oh, absolutely. I just love what Florence has said, especially the last bit where she says just start somewhere, because this whole thing looks like it's like a big anthill, and a lot of people don't quite know what the first steps are. Maybe this might actually bring the men, especially, to just sit up and listen to what I'm about to say here. When we all left Zimbabwe, when we all left Africa or wherever we came from, that sort of cut off our lineage, okay? The lineage that we started, our kids and our families, is going to start from us as the great ancestor or person that started the lineage in Australia. Now, I tell you something, we are the most documented generation. You don't want that when you're 92 or you're 98 and you start lying to your great grandkids that you did well, and they start looking you up online and they notice that you were not even contributing to your super just because you didn't do the right thing.
You can't even find your photo anywhere on the internet.
That stuff hurts, man. That stuff hurts. And they would then, maybe things are happening in Africa and they'll ask you, why did you even leave? You know what I mean? Things like that will just really get you to start thinking. So just look around, each and every one of us. I know I'm about to say something that will be very controversial. People would rather talk about sex than talk about money, and it's one of those things that is very prevalent, especially when money wasn't a subject within your family or household. I never grew up talking about money. Mention money and you and the shoe would be scrapped off the wall somewhere. It's just one of those things that happened, in the African sort of setup. So I just advise that look around yourself. In Australia, you could actually be living next door to a millionaire or somebody who's made a fortune. Just have a conversation while you're watering your gardens or on your way to school. How did you do that? What happened? You know what I mean? Don't be fooled by the rocks or no rocks that people have. Start having conversations that are deeper than what are we doing Friday night, or who's got a birthday party on Saturday. Start having different conversations, and before you know it, you might actually start meeting people that have done and are on their way to the top, and you never know what you would learn.
Yeah, and Florence, you mentioned something that I guess is quite important in terms of how people perceive what needs to be done, and they think that it could be too complex, too complicated, and therefore let me just take care of my little things here. For example, investing in shares. I mean, when you hear that, you may think of Wall Street, but it's not as complex as that. Nowadays, there are apps that will enable you to easily invest in shares, and as long as you continue putting it, and these apps are quite good. They still give a good return. And then there are people who are actually specialized in this area. I interviewed a lady from a Zimbabwean background. Again, I forgot her name. She's teaching women specifically how to invest in shares. This was only about 4-6 weeks ago. And she was explaining that it's not all that complex as people think, because there are people who can make it easy for you. You don't have to make all those decisions. You are not necessarily expected to be the wolf of Wall Street, all with all those calculations and everything. But I guess it's how do you start and where do you start, because it's not something that is necessarily habitual. It's not in our. I was going to say it's not in our culture, but that's because many of us before we come here, we might have heard of stock trading, but we don't see that happening a lot in our background. So how do you get people to overcome that fear and help them to move on and make some steps for that direction?
So the one thing that I found this quite fascinating with a lot of conversations that I have, a lot of people don't actually understand what sits in their superannuation account. If you look at your superannuation account, most likely it's heavily geared towards shares.
Yes.
And so you are getting a service there from your superannuation fund manager, where they are picking for you all sorts of weird and wonderful shares, without you having to do anything other than the deduction. I know people don't like super because there's some people who say, oh, I don't know what the government's going to say about super in the future, and I might not be able to get it and all the rest of it. And there are others who don't like the idea that they're not going to be able to touch the money for, until they hit whatever the preservation age is, 65 to 68, or however old you are right now. Yeah. So there are some people who are like that. If you're that sort of a person where you're like, I do want to do the investing, but I don't want to stick it in my super, because I think super it's a lazy way of doing it, but you still get the good returns, right? Yeah. All you have to do is make sure you're in a good super fund. And even that, the information is very easily available to see whether or not your fund is a good super fund or not, and whether or not the fees are ridiculous. If you're outside of that and you still actually want to find out the best way of going about this, one of the things that I found very helpful was there's actually an entire movement of people, and I was laughing when Prosper was saying earlier that he wants to retire. There's a movement of people who actually are trying to retire early, and it's called the FIRE movement. So it's Financial Independence Retire Early, so it's spelled fire like a flame, right? Mm-hmm. And that community is prolific in terms of their sharing of information, and in terms of the tracking of how a lot of them, people in their 30s, have actually retired. And most of them, when you look at what they've done, is even with the investments, right? They're not trying to pick the next Google stock or anything like that. Most of them are in a very simple mutual fund or ETF, which is just tracking the market. Whether it's ASX 200, whether it's in the States, whatever it is. But it doesn't need to be complicated. It really doesn't. And so they're literally just buying one item, and every time they get money, they just buy the same item over and over again. But for you to make those sorts of decisions, again, this is why I say, just go out and read. There's a lot out there, which you don't have to, or find someone who's doing it. You can then go down the route, as you were saying, of actually finding fund managers who then charge you, prices to pick stocks and all the rest of it. I have my own opinions about that in terms of whether or not that's the way to go. But again, I think if you go out there and read, you'll see that there's mixed opinions about whether that's the best route. Yes. But for someone who really just wants to keep it simple, there's enough information out there for you to actually just make that call.
All right.
Absolutely. Just one thing. I'm not a financial advisor, so please do not take whatever I'm about to say and use it in your retirement scheme. My lawyers are not going to be looking after that part. But there's a simple strategy, really, that if people follow it, you won't even have to worry about a lot of stuff. First of all, if you just save 10% of whatever income that you're earning, putting it away in some sort of high interest account, or with banks like Commonwealth or NAB or whatever, they have yet another arm where when they see that you now have a little bit of money in your account, they will invite you to places like ComSec or NAB Trade, and then they will just tell you or advise you on what would actually give you more bang for your buck. Once you've accumulated a bit of that money in those, places where you can maybe purchase ETFs, like what Florence was saying, I root for the STW, which is a cross section of all the 200 ASX listed companies, on the stock market. You now start moving that money into property. Now, property is maybe $500,000 here in Melbourne, $500,000. At a 10% deposit, that's like $50,000. And all you got to do is grow your money at that 10% ratio up until you get 50,000. And when you get that 50,000, put it into brick and mortar and let somebody else pay the rent to fulfill your mortgage. Okay. When you do that 3 or 4 or 5 times, I kid you not, that's a really good and nice nest egg without you having to worry about anything that comes, later on in the future. And if anything then happens, you can easily get rid of one of your properties, and it might actually pay off all the mortgages that you have, depending on how far you've gone in life. But it only starts with saving at least 10% of the income that you're earning every single month. And once you just keep growing it like that, I kid you not, you will actually at least be head and shoulders above anyone else that's trying to do, get rich quick schemes out there, or is buying a lottery ticket every single morning just in case they win $1 million.
Praying and hoping that God will listen, that you will get.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth. Sorry, could I just touch on something that Prosper said? It's probably worth stating that in Australia, the financial services regulations are actually extremely stringent. So APRA and AFSA, which is the one that looks after superannuation, they actually are very, very strict about who can give advice, who cannot give advice, what that advice looks like. And so if you go to a financial advisor, and this is why I'm saying, like, the places where you can get, even on, I'll do a plug, the only plug that I'll do here, because it's actually the government website, right, on financial services, called moneysmart.gov.au. And that's the government website. And that's the only plug I'm going to do in all of this. But even if you look on there and you look at, there are lots of tools there around budgeting, around things like investing, around, superannuation, all of that sort of stuff. One of the key things that you need to know is you need to understand yourself. You need to understand your own risk appetite. And you need to understand what will allow you to sleep at night. So in the group that I was talking about, where we've got a whole mix of people, we all have the same end goal, right? Which is wealth creation. But there's some people who are very happy to be highly negatively geared. They're literally, are down to their last cent in terms of the amount of money that they've got out in properties. There are others who won't even touch a credit card, right? And everything in between. You need to know what works for you. And then based on that, that is how you then decide what is the best investment strategy that you use, whether it's, you're buying shares, whether, there's some people, for example, I spoke to a CFA who was saying to me, I will never buy shares because there's nothing behind them. And I'm like, you realize you're buying a portion of the company, but you see what I mean? Like, that person was just not comfortable with shares. Like, that's not their thing. They want bricks. They wanted property, they want a title deed in their hands. So you need to know where do you fit in that? And then that helps you to make a decision about what's the best way to go and what that looks like for you.
Well, property investment is definitely one avenue that helps a lot of people to build wealth. And I had an interview yesterday with a property investment consultant, Alora, and we're talking about that subject. And in Australia here, property is very, very widely used by the people to build wealth. And some people do property flipping, others just get I suppose they build a portfolio, and that enables them to accumulate money, because at least in the Australian context, property value is kind of always going up.
I'm sorry, I'm going to contest that, because, and that's part of, and this is why with this particular topic, it's very difficult, right? Okay. Because you go back to a year and a half ago, and there were people literally selling land on Gumtree because they'd negatively geared themselves up so much. And this is out in, sorry, I'm trying to think, sort of Donnybrook area and that sort of area. Because the values of what they'd committed for the land and what the land was actually worth were now not in, and they didn't have the money to pay for the difference in the margin, right? I think it's one of those things where you need to do your research. You need to do your research. You need to make sure that when you make the decision, you're informed. And granted, things may go up and down, whatever. But at least if you feel like, hand on heart, you've done everything that you can to inform yourself, and that you're in a space where you're comfortable with the risk that you're taking, then fair enough.
Yep. I will grant you that. I suppose there are always risks in every area, and there are risks in the real estate as well as in shares investment in almost every strategy. There is, but it really remains the case that property is widely used as a wealth building. But I totally agree. You got to do your homework. Nobody's going to do that for you, and if you don't do it, then you may make mistakes, and mistakes can be quite costly. Okay, unfortunately, I feel like we've only started the conversation a little while ago, but time is already gone. Only have 45 minutes, and I see there's been a lot of people watching as well, even though they didn't do commenting. Only one says a great conversation. We need to continue this conversation. I guess it's part of the overall economic empowerment and success mindset sort of framework that I think there's a need of that more in our communities. And that's why we bring in many of these topics on this platform to try to, I suppose, trying to get a conversation started, and hopefully that goes much widely. Before we finish, because we're pretty much done, I just want to, if any one of you can mention, for example, a book that you may have read that people may want to research. I mean, they may want to go and read in their journey to building wealth and looking at retirement strategy.
Cool. I mean, obviously, I'm just gonna say, like what Florence says. Your life story is totally different, and retirement in Australia is not set in stone. Do what really feels right for you. You can retire whenever you want to, but the factors that play part. You want to consider your health. You want to consider your own financial situation. You want to consider your employability. Are you going to be working throughout, or are you going to stop working at a certain time? And you also want to consider, if you've got a partner, you and your partner's individual preferences, because you can't just do these decisions on your own. And one big thing, your age. And one book that I'm going to suggest is Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's a fundamental start to your financial education. And once you get past the jargon, it will be easy for you to now start looking, for certain things. Because I kid you not, people can say Kardashian, but they cannot say debentures. All right. So it depends on what it is that you absolutely love, in your life.
Okay. Florence, any book that comes to your mind?
I'm going to take a step back, and I'm actually going to talk about just the fundamentals, because we're talking about investing. There's some people who just don't even do the minimum sort of saving discipline, and are caught up in credit card debts, and just that fundamentals about how do I even budget. They don't even have that. That's actually a significant majority of people. So I'm going to go for The Barefoot Investor by Scott Pape. And that's just, for me, that's just about fundamentals, about how do you actually just start thinking about putting aside money to be able to even start talking about investing afterwards.
Okay. Eugene, anything that comes to your mind? I know you said
I'm one of the people Florence mentioned who's scared to even touch a credit card. So
oh, trust me, I'm with you on that one. So
so yeah, I'm going to start with the books they've recommended, because to be honest, I do jobs and I get paid for them, and I live off that, and then I do the next job. So I've never invested anything, and but after today's conversation, I'm starting to think maybe it's not as terrifying as I thought it might be. So I've learned something today.
Yeah, one thing I would mention quickly, I read a book entitled "The Richest Man in Babylon." I think it's a classic as well. It does provide quite good insight in wealth building. I would encourage people to go and get that book. It's actually even freely available on the internet. You don't even need to go to a library and pick one. Richest Man in Babylon. So it's all part of trying to change their mindset and focus on economic empowerment and wealth creation. It's as important as any other side of personal and community development. So that is all for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, as usual, for your time to this wonderful conversation we've had. And we're going to now swap to the network part that is just starting. We're actually running a little late with that as well. So we swap to Zoom. Those of you who are watching, if you want to attend the networking session, you must have probably received some emails with the link. Just click on that and we'll get on the Zoom. All right. Thanks very much. And we'll see you again next Friday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Clyde.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.